I'm sitting here today in a very unique building, the only one of its kind in the whole of the United Kingdom. And it's the Museum of Immigration in London's East End, an area where refugees have been coming for many centuries. And the interesting thing about this building is that it initially was a Huguenot house of the Georgian period, where Huguenot refugees who came from France in the 17th century were given refuge in this area. So it's not an accident that we're filming here, because the subject I want to discuss today with Professor Bridget Anderson, Professor of Citizenship at Oxford University, is the whole question of immigration. Why this has become such a poisonous issue in European politics today, why it still torments many people in the United States of America. Bridget, welcome.
Thank you.
It could be said that the entire history of the world is really the history of immigration. So the fact that something that has been going on literally for over 1,000 years, suddenly in the 21st century becomes a hot potato, becomes something which you can't discuss, something you just mention, immigration, and people's hackles rise up. How do you explain this?
Well, I suppose I would locate the beginning of mobility, let's call it, far earlier. I mean, 80,000 years ago, people moved from East Africa and spread all over the world. But we don't think of that mobility somehow as being immigration. We think of that as being explorers or soldiers or traders, or we don't really think of that as immigration. So I think what's really new about immigration isn't so much mobility. After all, you know, we're not plants, we're humans, we move. It's not so much mobility. What's new is the particular form of the nation state and nation state borders that really was globally rolled out relatively recently. I mean, it had its roots in Europe, in the Treaty of Westphalia, most famously, but actually globally, really it was only rolled out, I would say, at the end of the Second World War. And what that has meant is the sorting of people into boxes where they're supposed to stay, a citizenship regime, and an idea that actually moving is somehow kind of wrong or unnatural. But I would say also that there's something about immigration, and perhaps this is a particularly, well, not peculiarly British, but maybe we see its kind of apogee in Britain, which is that actually it stands in for a lot of other things. So it stands in, I would say, for an anxiety about globalization, about neoliberal capital, and also about a lack of political accountability. And I think that kind of translates into an anxiety about immigration, an idea that somehow, you know, people are coming and taking jobs, a fear when you look out at the world of the sort of huge global inequality and poverty, so I better hold on to what I can get. So I think all of that then translates into this anxiety.
People today would be very surprised, many people, to know that passports are a relatively new invention, that prior to this period, people within Europe and other parts of the world didn't have papers, they just traveled.
Well, passports are a relatively recent invention. I mean, you know, we're talking about very early 20th century, but the passeport was actually a document that was required in what we now call England to monitor the mobility actually of the vagrant and
within the country.
Within the country. So masterless men, as they were called, people who left their master rather than being a good feudal serf and who were off on the road, had to have a document that proved that they were going on their master's business from town A to town B. Now, by the mid-16th century, any self-respecting vagrant would have a false document. So in many ways, I think that, you know, again, with our sort of hat on of thinking, assuming nation states, we forget about the ways in which the mobility of the poor has always been a source of anxiety, has has long been sought to be controlled. If we look back as far as the 12th century, there was an anxiety about serfs leaving their masters, because, and it's very similar today. So there was an anxiety about what that was going to do to wages. There was an anxiety too, critically, about masterless men. As I say, that is what we would now call social cohesion. Because at that time, leaving your master, roaming about, selling your services for money was viewed as highly disruptive to the social and economic order. In the same way, I would say that moving from the country that you're supposed to be in to seek work in another country is too actually highly disruptive. So I think we have to kind of link back this idea of control of mobility and control of labour, because these valiant beggars were also, it was said, lazy. They weren't prepared to stick it out and work with their master. So, and again, you can see the origin of the welfare scrounger in the same kind of route. So I think, given that we're now being told welfare scrounger and immigrant, two sides of the same coin, let's go back. Yes, they are two sides of the same coin, and it has a very long history.
Let's talk about the Roma people. Roma families have actually been set on fire in Naples. Roma have been put into camps in France by a so-called socialist government, justifying what its predecessors were doing. There is a fear of Romas even in parts of Spain, and the whole continent, European continent in fact, is quite paranoid about them. But the Roma came to this continent, I mean, 1,000 years ago. So how do you explain this particular refusal to accept the Roma as part of Europe?
So I suppose it's, I would say, two things. One is that we need to look at this fear of mobility, actually, and of the importance of regulating mobility. And if people's mobility is not being properly regulated, then they are, as I say, potentially disruptive. But also, of course, as we know, many Roma now are settled or have been settled. And I think that there we see that there's also an anxiety about good citizens, an idea of what a citizen should be like. And actually, once we start unpacking the way who that good citizen is and how one attains good citizenship, we can see that the Roma, in common with minority ethnic groups, with black groups, with so there's a kind of racialized element, but there is also, I would say, an element of desire to control labour and put people to work in the proper kind of jobs. All of those things, I think, get fused in the question of the Roma, which, despite Europe's shameful history, it seems that it's forgotten that and has moved on, rather than properly interrogating what happened. So, for example, I was at a conference a couple of days ago, and they were talking about the Sinti, and how the Sinti, there had been no apology or reparation from the German government, nor was one ever required, for the gassing of the Sinti people on the basis that they were deemed to be antisocial. And these people had waged, the Roma group, and the Sinti in particular, had waged a long campaign of 60 years to say, you know, number one, what do you mean by A, or antisocial? And number two, just because you believe that doesn't mean we should be gassed. And the fact that it has taken decades to win that argument in Europe, I think, is absolutely shameful.
Bridget, let's come now to the 20th century, when the question of immigration became really huge. Of the migrants who began to come because they were being persecuted, tortured, burnt alive, I'm referring to the, anti-Semitic pogroms that took place in Tsarist Russia, in Poland, in parts of that old Austro-Hungarian Empire, and who sought refuge here. Now, when they first started arriving, were there any restrictions?
There weren't restrictions when they first started arriving. However, there was tremendous hostility particularly from the trade union movement, for example. So there was a lot of anti-Semitic anxiety, and when the first immigration controls were initiated in 1906, partly as a result of this anti-Semitism, what's noticeable is the people in first class were not subject to controls. So the anxiety was about the people in steerage, basically the poor people. They were the ones that were targeted. And I would say that really, again, we can see still the kind of roots of current immigration controls in that very key distinction between, in the sort of fact that the wealthier people were allowed in without restriction. And so whenever people talk about our proud heritage of welcoming Jews and Huguenots, I always want to kind of put my hand up and say, hang on a minute. Yeah.
People are very reluctant now to admit that a lot of the things that are being said about Muslims today were said about the Jews in the 20s, 30s and 40s. They're the other, they have their own funny religion, they wear strange clothes, kaftans and these funny hats, they have their own diet, their Sabbath is not the Sunday but the Saturday, they're outsiders, etc., etc., etc.
Yeah, no, well, obviously I agree with that, and and the sort of obsession with integration and people refusing to integrate, I think certainly has echoes of that. But I wonder too how much of it is, as I say, really about creating, in the most crude way, a scapegoat. Is actually we can have a lot of heat and light about immigration, about terrorism, and I think we can see on the one hand the concern about terrorists coming over on the boats in the Mediterranean, and on the other hand the concern about terrorists leaving. So it's a very confused discussion really, but how much of this is really generating more heat than light, so we don't look at some of the real problems that we have. So I suppose I think the refusal to learn the lessons of history is perhaps not emanating so much from the policymakers and the people that control the discourse as perhaps from us who are perhaps more subject to it. And we need to be making more interventions on that line, on that basis, I think.
Then also we're now approaching the Second World War. Most of the principal European countries, Western European countries, are also imperialist countries. They control and own and occupy large tracts of the world. Britain, of course, was the world's largest empire. And initially, there was no immigration control at all. If you were, for instance, let's take Britain. If you were a citizen of the British Commonwealth, you had the right to enter Britain, you had the right to come and vote here. I mean, I give you a small example, myself. I came here to study at Oxford in 1963. Didn't need a visa, passport stamped. After I'd been here 5 years, I had automatic right of citizenship, which now is no longer automatic, by the way, but it was then automatic. And people today, if you tell them this, are just stunned, saying, then why did they stop it? So why did they stop it, Bridget?
Well, so I mean, yes, British subjects had the ability to move freely within the empire. But actually that was already a problem, sorry to go backwards in history, but was already a problem by the late 19th century, when you had the mobility of, or the forced mobility effectively of indentured Indian labourers to southern Africa and the
Caribbean.
And the Caribbean, but in this particular case, the desire to control the associated mobility of so-called free Indians. So how could these governments facilitate the mobility of indentured labour, but not the movement of free Indians, particularly given that Queen Victoria had made these great sort of overtures about equality and what a fine thing that British Empire was. And actually the way that they did it was to say, okay, you can move freely and we're not going to have any colour bar on our legislation, but you have to be able to speak English and have £25. So of course, you have to be able to speak a European language. So what that meant effectively was that when Indians who were not indentured moved, they were tested, and if you were a white Englishman coming from London, you'd be tested in English, fine. If you were Indian, you'd be tested in Dutch, European language, that's what it says in the law. We're not discriminating, you know, so that, and I think that distinction, the way that then operated through language and through property, effectively, £25 was quite a lot of money in those days. Again, we've seen that kind of rolled out later on. So now, you know, effectively, if you have some kind of economic and social capital, you will find your mobility is far easier, even if you have a visa regime against you, than you will if you are, for example, poor, desperate and seeking asylum.
If one looks at the statistics of people coming into Britain and people going out, it's quite interesting. Often you had, or if not often, occasionally, you had more people leaving, emigrating to the, you know, safe white places, South Africa, Rhodesia, Australia, Canada, some to the United States later, than were coming into Britain. And you see a real link, especially in the 50s and the 60s, before they imposed more immigration controls, that the number of people coming into Britain was actually proportional to the number of jobs available. So when you had slight rise in unemployment, the number of migrants went down. In other words, the employment market controlled to a certain extent people who came to work, or their relatives said there's no work here, don't come, till they decided to impose immigration controls when there was a huge rush. Let's get in because they're going to stop us.
Well, I think in a way you can see even today the importance of looking at the labour market in terms of creating a demand for labour. So we see, and the way that the labour market functions, so we see today this tremendous anxiety about the free movement of EU nationals. They all want to come to Britain because Britain's such a marvellous place. Well, I think actually if you look at the structure of our labour market, at the kinds of jobs that are being created, precarious, low-waged, antisocial hours, temporary, they're jobs actually that if you have a life in the UK, if you have children, if you have to look after your parents, it's quite difficult to do some of these jobs because actually they demand that you're totally subservient to the demands of the labour market. And I would argue that's a key reason why we have so many EU migrants who, let's not forget, are predominantly young and still predominantly single, who have that kind of flexibility, who are then moving into these jobs. So I would say immigration very often is a symptom of other issues. So even if we see what's happening in the Mediterranean today, you know, we're seeing gross global inequality, we're seeing the wars at the edges of Europe, we've seen European intervention in Libya and the Middle East, you know, all of these are what's creating this movement of people. If we then say now we have an immigration problem, whether that's an immigration problem of EU migrants or an immigration problem of people coming over on boats in the Mediterranean, if we think about it as an immigration problem alone and try to solve it as an immigration problem, we're on a hiding to nothing.
Because effectively what we're seeing is the impact of this turbocharged capitalism, what is known as globalization, and also the effects not just of war, but the crash of 2008. And countries which are better protected in terms of trade union rights, etc., still have certain standards. So you have a lot of people from France coming over here and doing jobs, Italians, Spaniards, etc., etc. It's not a racial thing, this. It's an economic thing, very clearly. And this is what they can't tackle, because even the people leaving Africa, you know, and coming on boats and being drowned, and cabinet ministers in European governments laughing at them, saying that'll teach them a lesson, they'll stop coming. It completely ignores the fact that systematically the IMF and the World Bank totally wrecked the social infrastructure of many African countries. So there was no safety net at all. So what do people do? They go where there is work.
I agree with you absolutely about turbocharged capitalism and how we have to understand the role of migration within that, the position of migration within that. But also people make choices. People decide. People are not simply victims of this, and they develop their own responses and routes. And I would say that what we see with China is actually precisely part of those arguably grassroots responses. Of course, the tougher the entry controls, then the more people have to pay and the more organised and systematic the routes become. And so therefore the rise of perhaps more violent and what states would call more criminal elements end up controlling these routes.
But the criminal elements, if you sometimes hear them, which is rare, but occasionally someone speaks up for them, and they say, well, we live in a world where the market is sacred, where we are told that every demand can be fulfilled by the market. And people call us criminals, but we're just operating the market. There's a big desire by people in different parts of the world to reach Europe, and we're just helping them out. So you've created the system and we're just using it.
Yeah, and that's certainly, you know, there's plenty of completely bona fide recruitment agencies that are doing exactly the same as these people. And let's not forget what happened just a few days ago with the Australian Coast Guard allegedly paying money to smugglers in order to return people back to Indonesia. So I don't think that we can say that actually states are the good guys and their hands are free. And it's actually also the kinds of controls and violence at borders is effectively what's putting people into the arms of people who of these dangerous moves. So most people, I'm sure, would rather get on a Ryanair or EasyJet flight to come over to England, not on a rickety boat or hidden in the back of a van. But that's what they're effectively forced to do. And then the government have the cheek to say that they are concerned about modern day slavery and evil traffickers. So the hypocrisy is outstanding.
So Bridget, what is the solution to all this? Is there an easy solution? Because the argument now is so well established in Europe in particular that we're already, you know, we've got mass unemployment, we can't allow any refugees or asylum seekers or migrant seeking work in. We are, all the old argument, we are overcrowded, these people are coming and using our social services, etc., etc., etc.
Well, so one thing I would say is, first of all, we have to think, what is the problem? Is the problem really immigration? As I say, I'm not convinced that the problem is immigration. So if you want a solution, we have to start with identifying what the problem is. However, in terms of everyday practice, I would say two things. One is that the nation states and policymakers are not going to policy their way out of it. You know, we need to support any kind of progressive elements within that, and but I think that actually the key thing is what people on the ground are doing. So people who are both supporting the rights of undocumented migrants and asylum seekers, but also who are trying to make connections between the struggles of citizens, people who are unemployed, who are homeless, who have problems with the law, and linking that to migrants, actually saying we are not competitors for the privileges of membership, because I think that's the lie that has been fed and that has worked very effectively and is continuing to work very effectively. We are not competitors for the privileges of membership. We do have common interests, and we have to start finding those, and we have to start finding them quickly and actually putting them very centrally into our political action. So I would say, for me, a two-tiered approach. One is supporting any slivers of progressive or possible politics at a national level, but I think more importantly, taking immigration and making connections with other political struggles.
You see, because the dispute now about within the European Union between Britain and the EU effectively centers more or less on this issue, because the British ruling elite is nervous about this problem. But when the EU was set up, I mean, it was very clear that all members of the European Union have the right to travel to other countries within the European Union. And the argument was straightforward. If free movement of capital, why not free movement of labor? And so for the restricted arena of the European Union, that was accepted, but of course not for the rest of the world.
Well, but let's remember, it's not free movement, it's free movement of all EU citizens, but not residents. That's workers. So, you know, if you don't have a job or you're not self-sufficient after 3 months, then you can't stay. So I think actually that's an important factor, because what we're seeing, I think, with the EU is the rise of the worker citizen. And actually, again, that's a phenomenon we see in the UK. You might have rights as a citizen, but it's the taxpayer who has to pay for it. And increasingly, governments, not just the UK, but throughout Europe, are summoning the vision of the taxpayer as the person to whom they're accountable rather than the citizen. And that, I would say, is linked to this rise of the worker citizen, and the EU citizen is the archetypal worker citizen. And so we have the control, and in a way we're back to the beginning of our conversation, because now you can no longer control the mobility of people through immigration controls. We're going back to the Poor Law, where the mobility of people was controlled through access to arms and poor relief. Effectively, that's what we're seeing, I would argue, in the EU now.
I mean, the other solution, of course, is for all migrants, or people wanting to move from one country to the other, to become millionaires. Don't you think?
Yes.
Given that millionaires have no problems at all from moving to one country to the other. You say, this is the amount in my bank, here's the chit proving it, and you're not only welcome, but you're also given citizenship. I mean, it's just so crude and linked so openly now to wealth that, you know, you wonder how any norms can be established in this world.
Well, that's certainly true. So that there's many states where you can actually buy citizenship, and
Britain included.
Technicality, I would say there's slightly not, but it's easier, far easier to get citizenship if you're wealthy. But in some countries, you can actually just turn up, say, I've got 10 million and I'm not even living here, but I want to get your citizenship. And that's used by millionaires as a way...
In order to avoid paying taxes?
Yes, and to facilitate mobility. And again, I think what we see is the relation between property and citizenship. Again, let's go back to the kind of roots of the nature of liberal states and the roots of citizenship. And I think the relation between property and citizenship is very much being exposed in the contemporary era. So immigration controls are concerned to limit the mobility of the global poor. As you say, if you're wealthy, and increasingly you've kind of got to be super wealthy, then you can move freely. And that's what I suppose, for my ultimate answer to the problem, I would say that we really do have to have free movement and eliminate border controls that attempt to control the mobility of ordinary people.
So you would be for no immigration controls?
Yes, I would be for no immigration controls.
It's a very radical view. Bridget, thank you very much.
Thank you.